Hey guys. Tonight, we begin with two medieval systems that seem completely unrelated until you realize they both solved the same fundamental problem: how to make people behave without constant surveillance. Medieval cities needed infrastructure, like bridges, walls, and public buildings, but they didn't have modern taxation systems that could reliably fund construction. They also needed communication systems that could alert populations to danger or organize collective action at night. But they couldn't use modern emergency broadcasts or sirens. The solutions were brilliantly pragmatic and deeply intertwined with how medieval people understood morality, community, and social control. Here's the connection that makes tonight's exploration worthwhile. Medieval authorities discovered that fines for sexual misconduct generated enormous, predictable revenue streams that could fund major public works. Prostitution fines, adultery penalties, fornication fees, and various other charges for behaviors the church condemned but cities pragmatically tolerated created budgets that built bridges, paved streets, constructed fortifications, and funded charitable institutions. Meanwhile, those same cities needed to communicate complex information through darkness using church bells, a system so sophisticated that trained listeners could distinguish between fire alarms, invasion warnings, religious observances, time announcements, and dozens of other messages. The bells rang constantly through medieval nights without causing panic because everyone understood the code. These systems reveal something profound about medieval social organization. Modern societies separate infrastructure funding from moral enforcement and emergency communication from religious practice. Medieval societies integrated everything. The prostitute's fine paid for the bridge she crossed. The bell that called monks to prayer also warned of fires. The moral framework that justified sexual regulation also legitimized using those regulations as taxation. And the religious institution that enforced sexual morality also operated the communication infrastructure that organized community response to danger. Nothing was isolated. Everything connected to everything else through webs of practical necessity and theological justification that modern people find difficult to parse because we've compartmentalized what medieval people integrated. Tonight, we're examining how medieval cities turned moral regulation into infrastructure funding, and how they created sophisticated acoustic communication systems that operated continuously without causing alarm fatigue. We'll see how prostitution zones became municipal revenue sources, how adultery fines funded bridge construction, how church bells communicated dozens of distinct messages through careful variation in rhythm and tone, and how entire urban populations learned to sleep through nightly bell sequences while remaining alert to genuine emergency signals. This is the story of how medieval people solved practical problems through systems that violated every modern instinct about separating church and state, morality and economics, communication and religion. If this kind of deep examination of how medieval infrastructure really worked appeals to you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Candle History, but only if you appreciate historical analysis that doesn't simplify complicated systems into easy modern categories. I'd love to hear in the comments whether you think modern societies could ever integrate moral enforcement and infrastructure funding the way medieval cities did, or whether that integration created more problems than it solved. Now settle in and let's explore how sex work paid for bridges and how bells talked without screaming. Medieval cities faced a fiscal challenge that shaped their entire approach to moral regulation. They needed substantial, reliable revenue for public works, but lacked systematic taxation infrastructure that could extract money from populations without causing resistance or economic disruption. The solution was pragmatic and morally complicated. They identified behaviors that were constant, widespread, relatively easy to detect, and officially immoral. Then they monetized enforcement. Sexual misconduct was perfect. People were always going to engage in prohibited sexual behaviors regardless of religious teaching or legal threats. Cities couldn't stop it, but they could profit from it through fines that generated steady revenue while maintaining the fiction of moral enforcement. The theoretical framework came from ecclesiastical law combined with Roman legal traditions. The Church taught that fornication, adultery, prostitution, and various other sexual behaviors were sins requiring penance and punishment. Roman law provided precedents for fines and regulatory fees. Medieval cities synthesized these traditions into systems where sexual misconduct was officially prohibited, practically tolerated, and systematically monetized. A woman caught in prostitution would be fined, not executed or imprisoned. The fine would go into municipal coffers designated for public works. She would be free to continue working after paying, understanding that future fines were inevitable. The system worked because everyone understood the game. Moral condemnation justified the fines. Practical tolerance ensured continued revenue. Public works provided visible benefits that legitimized the entire arrangement. London developed one of the most sophisticated systems by the 13th century. The city licensed brothels in specific districts, primarily Southwark across the Thames, which was technically under the Bishop of Winchester's jurisdiction. The bishop profited from prostitution licensing fees, while the city collected fines for violations of regulations about solicitation, hours of operation, and acceptable behavior. This created dual revenue streams, where both ecclesiastical and secular authorities benefited financially from activity they simultaneously condemned morally. The arrangement required cognitive dissonance that medieval authorities managed through careful separation of moral and fiscal rhetoric. In church, prostitution was sinful and condemned. In municipal accounting records, prostitution was a revenue line item supporting bridge maintenance and street paving. The scale of revenue was substantial. Paris in the 14th century collected enough from prostitution fines and licensing to fund significant portions of its public works budget. Some French cities used prostitution revenue specifically to fund bridge construction and maintenance, creating direct links between sexual commerce and infrastructure. The famous Pont d'Avignon, one of medieval Europe's most important bridges, was partially funded through fines collected from prostitution and other sexual misconduct in Avignon's papal territories. The irony of the Holy See benefiting from prostitution revenue while condemning such activity theologically was not lost on contemporary critics or later historians, but it was economically rational within medieval fiscal frameworks. Adultery fines operated differently but generated similar revenues. When married individuals were caught in extramarital relationships, ecclesiastical courts would levy fines as part of the penance process. These fines were theoretically spiritual punishments designed to correct behavior, but they also generated revenue that supported both church operations and, through agreements with secular authorities, public works. The wealthier the adulterer, the higher the fine, creating progressive taxation hidden within moral enforcement. A merchant caught with his neighbor's wife might pay enough to pave a street section. A noble's affair could fund a public fountain. The system turned private moral failures into public infrastructure improvements, while maintaining that the purpose was spiritual correction rather than revenue extraction. The direct connection between prostitution and bridge construction wasn't metaphorical or coincidental. Many medieval cities explicitly designated prostitution revenues for bridge maintenance and construction through legal frameworks that created hypotheticated funding streams. A bridge was extraordinarily expensive infrastructure requiring constant maintenance, periodic reconstruction after floods or wars, and ongoing investment to remain functional. Cities needed reliable, substantial revenue sources dedicated to bridge funding that wouldn't compete with other municipal needs. Prostitution revenue was perfect because it was predictable, substantial, morally defensible as a punishment for sin, and psychologically satisfying because sinners were literally building the infrastructure that served righteous citizens. Avignon's bridge system exemplified this arrangement. The city's prostitution zones were concentrated in areas near the bridge approaches, creating geographic clustering that simplified enforcement and collection. Women working in these zones paid licensing fees annually or quarterly, plus fines for violations of regulations about solicitation methods, customer treatment, or territorial disputes. The revenue was earmarked explicitly for the bridge fund, a dedicated account that paid for construction, repairs, and the salaries of bridge administrators who managed tolls and maintenance. This created a fiscal cycle where prostitution revenue ensured bridge functionality attracted commerce, commercial activity increased prostitution demand, and increased demand generated more revenue for the bridge. The system was self-sustaining as long as moral condemnation of prostitution remained strong enough to justify the fines, but weak enough to allow continuation of the activity. London's Southwark development followed similar patterns. The southern approach to London Bridge concentrated entertainment, hospitality, and prostitution in ways that generated enormous revenues for bridge maintenance. The bridge was one of medieval London's most valuable assets, enabling commerce between the city and the south, while also serving as a fortified entry point that could be defended during conflicts. Maintaining it required substantial ongoing investment. The solution was to tolerate and regulate prostitution in Southwark, collect licensing fees and fines, and direct that revenue to bridge administration. The Bishop of Winchester's ownership of much of Southwark created the additional benefit that ecclesiastical and secular authorities both profited from arrangements that were officially immoral but practically lucrative. The moral justification for this system was elegant, if somewhat cynical. Authorities argued that prostitution was inevitable due to human weakness, that attempting to eliminate it completely would drive it underground, where it would be less controllable and more dangerous, and that regulated prostitution was preferable to unregulated vice. By allowing prostitution in designated areas with licensing and oversight, cities claimed they were minimizing harm while generating revenue that served the common good through infrastructure improvements. The prostitute's sin was being transformed into public benefit through the alchemical process of regulatory monetization. Bridges built with prostitution fines were simultaneously monuments to human vice and human redemption through infrastructure that served everyone regardless of moral status. Critics of the system existed throughout the medieval period. Some religious reformers argued that profiting from sin was itself sinful, that cities and bishops were effectively operating as pimps, and that the entire arrangement violated Christian principles regardless of how the revenue was used. These critics pointed out that defending prostitution as inevitable while profiting from it created perverse incentives where authorities had financial interests in maintaining vice rather than reducing it. The response from city administrators and pragmatic clergy was that infrastructure served God's purposes by enabling commerce, travel, and community, and that God could transform evil into good through human institutional creativity. The bridges stood as physical evidence that the system worked, whatever its moral complications. People crossed bridges daily without thinking about how they were funded, which was probably the point. Fornication, defined as sexual relations between unmarried people, was technically illegal under both ecclesiastical and secular law throughout medieval Europe, but was practiced widely and punished inconsistently. The inconsistency was partly theological confusion about whether fornication was as serious as adultery or prostitution, and partly practical recognition that unmarried young people were going to have sex regardless of legal prohibitions. Cities developed elaborate systems of selective enforcement, where some fornication cases resulted in prosecution and fines, while most were ignored, creating revenue streams that were unpredictable in individual cases but reliable in aggregate. Young people would eventually get caught. They would pay fines, and those fines would fund public construction. The selective enforcement system created interesting social dynamics. Wealthier families could often negotiate to avoid formal prosecution if their children were caught in fornication, paying informal settlements to ecclesiastical authorities that might or might not be recorded officially. Poorer individuals faced formal prosecution more consistently because they lacked the social capital to arrange informal settlements. This created de facto progressive enforcement, where the wealthy paid more when caught, but had more tools to avoid official consequences, while the poor paid less but faced more consistent formal punishment. The result was revenue from both official and unofficial channels, both of which could fund public works through different accounting mechanisms. Cathedral construction, in particular, benefited from fornication fine revenue. Cathedrals were community projects that required sustained funding over decades or centuries. They needed revenue sources that were relatively stable and could be justified theologically. Using fines from sexual misconduct to build churches had beautiful theological symmetry. The sinner's money was literally being transformed into sacred architecture. The stones of the cathedral were purchased with funds from moral failure, creating physical manifestations of God's ability to redeem human weakness. Masons working on cathedrals partially funded by fornication fines were building with the wages of sin, though few probably thought about it in those terms while doing the actual work. Paris developed particularly sophisticated systems where different types of sexual misconduct funded different types of public works. Prostitution revenue went primarily to bridge maintenance. Fornication fines funded charitable institutions and some church construction. Adultery penalties funded defensive walls and municipal buildings. This categorization created a moral hierarchy encoded in infrastructure, where the most serious sexual sins funded the most important defensive structures, while lesser sins funded less critical projects. The system presumed that God's providence would ensure appropriate alignment between sin severity and infrastructure importance, though skeptics might observe that municipal accounting logic probably drove the categorization as much as theological reasoning. The documentation of these systems is extensive, but often hidden in accounting records rather than explicit policy statements. Medieval city treasurers recorded revenue sources using euphemisms or Latin terminology that obscured the connection between sexual misconduct and public funding. A bridge construction account might list revenue from fines for moral infractions or ecclesiastical penalties for carnal sins, without explicitly stating that this meant prostitution licensing fees and adultery fines. The obfuscation served political purposes by allowing authorities to benefit from vice revenue without drawing attention to the moral complications. Modern historians reading these records can identify the patterns, but contemporary citizens might not have fully understood how their bridges and churches were financed unless they worked in municipal administration or ecclesiastical courts. Medieval theologians developed elaborate justifications for transforming sin into public good through monetary punishment. The theological framework began with Augustine's concept that God could bring good from evil without endorsing the evil, that divine providence could use human wickedness to accomplish righteous purposes. This concept, applied to fiscal policy, meant that money obtained from fines for sexual sin could fund infrastructure that served Christian community without morally tainting the infrastructure itself. The prostitute's fine became holy when it purchased stones for a bridge that enabled pilgrims to travel to shrines. The adulterer's penalty became righteous when it funded a hospital that cared for the sick. The mechanism of transformation was the proper authority, collecting, managing, and directing the funds toward godly purposes. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, provided more systematic theological analysis of this process in discussions of restitution and penance. He argued that sinners had moral obligations to make restitution for harms caused by their sins, that monetary penalties could serve as partial restitution to the community harmed by moral disorder, and that directing such penalties toward public benefit was appropriate because sin harmed the entire Christian community. A prostitute's fine wasn't just punishment. It was restitution for the moral pollution her activity created, with the payment going toward infrastructure that would benefit the community she had harmed. This transformed the economic transaction from simple punishment into a form of justice, where the sinner participated in healing the social damage of her sin. The concept of purgatorial economics also influenced these systems. Medieval Christianity developed elaborate theories about how sinners could reduce purgatorial punishment through good works, charitable giving, and other meritorious actions. Paying fines for sexual misconduct could be framed as a form of penance that reduced divine punishment while simultaneously funding public goods. The prostitute who paid her fine and saw that money build a bridge might understand herself as participating in redemptive work that benefited both her soul and her community. Whether this theological framing actually comforted prostitutes facing fines is unknown, but it provided ecclesiastical authorities with moral justification for profiting from activities they condemned. Critics within the church challenged these justifications persistently. Monastic reformers and some mendicant orders argued that profiting from sin, regardless of how the profit was used, created moral hazard and incentive structures that encouraged authorities to tolerate vice rather than eliminate it. If a bishop's diocese benefited financially from prostitution fines, did the bishop have sufficient incentive to actually reduce prostitution? If a city's bridge maintenance depended on adultery penalties, would the city really want to reduce adultery? These critics suggested that the entire system was corrupt, that it made authorities complicit in sin, and that true Christian governance would fund infrastructure through voluntary contributions or legitimate taxation rather than monetized moral failure. The pragmatic response was that idealism without practical mechanisms achieved nothing. Cities needed bridges. Cathedrals required funding. Voluntary contributions were insufficient for major public works. Legitimate taxation faced resistance and practical collection difficulties. The monetization of sexual misconduct provided reliable revenue that enabled infrastructure construction that served Christian purposes. The theological complexity could be managed through careful moral reasoning, but the practical benefits were undeniable. The bridges stood. The cathedrals rose. The hospitals cared for the sick. Whether the funding mechanism was theologically pure mattered less than whether it accomplished good works in the world. This utilitarian argument won among administrators and practical clergy, while idealists continued their critiques from positions that rarely included responsibility for actual infrastructure funding. Medieval church bells served dozens of distinct communication functions that modern emergency sirens barely approximate. A trained medieval urbanite could hear a bell sequence and immediately understand whether it announced a religious service, a fire, an invasion, a death, a celebration, a curfew, the time, or any number of other messages. This wasn't intuition or magic. It was learned language, using variations in tone, rhythm, duration, and pattern to convey specific information. The bells spoke in code that everyone learned from childhood, creating an auditory communication network that operated continuously without causing panic or confusion, because the language was precise and standardized. The basic grammar of bell language started with the most fundamental distinction: the number of bells ringing simultaneously. A single bell ringing alone conveyed different information than multiple bells ringing together. The specific bell mattered too, with larger bells typically used for more important announcements, and smaller bells for routine timekeeping or minor notices. A bell tower might contain 6 bells of different sizes, each with its own tone and associated meanings. The largest bell ringing alone immediately signaled maximum importance or danger. Smaller bells in combination might announce routine religious observances that required no particular response beyond awareness. Rhythm and pattern created the detailed vocabulary. A steady, repeated toll at regular intervals meant something different from rapid and irregular ringing. Long pauses between sequences conveyed different urgency than continuous ringing. Specific patterns became associated with specific messages through convention and formal regulation. Many cities had ordinances defining official bell sequences for common situations. 3 tolls followed by pause for curfew. Continuous rapid ringing for fire. Specific patterns of tolls for different religious observances. These patterns were taught to children as part of basic civic education, ensuring that multiple generations shared the same interpretive framework. When bells rang in the night, people didn't panic or ignore them. They listened, decoded the message, and responded appropriately. The system worked because it was overdetermined, meaning that multiple aspects of the ringing combined to create unmistakable messages. Fire alarms didn't just ring rapidly, they rang all available bells simultaneously in continuous, irregular patterns that were impossible to mistake for anything else. The combination of maximum volume, continuous ringing, and chaotic rhythm created an acoustic profile distinct from any other message. Nobody hearing fire bells would confuse them with religious observances or time announcements because the patterns were designed to be mutually exclusive. This redundancy prevented miscommunication, even if listeners missed some aspects of the ringing or if atmospheric conditions distorted the sound. Bell ringers were trained professionals who understood the importance of precise execution. They couldn't improvise or make errors without risking miscommunication that could endanger the community. A bell ringer who signaled fire when there was no fire could cause panic, property damage from people hastily evacuating, or even injuries if people responded to false alarms dangerously. A bell ringer who failed to ring fire bells during an actual fire could be held legally and financially responsible for damages. The position carried status, regular wages, and housing in or near the bell tower, but it also carried enormous responsibility. These were civic positions requiring skill, training, sobriety, and reliability. Cities didn't entrust bell towers to random volunteers. Medieval urbanites developed remarkable ability to sleep through routine bell sequences while remaining alert to emergency signals. A skill that seems almost superhuman to modern people, used to being awakened by any unexpected sound. The secret was habituation combined with pattern recognition that operated at subconscious levels. Bells rang for religious observances throughout the night at predictable times with familiar patterns. A person sleeping in a medieval city learned from childhood that certain bell sequences were routine and required no response. The brain learned to filter these expected sounds as environmental background rather than urgent signals requiring attention. But the same brain remained alert to pattern violations or emergency sequences that deviated from the routine. The monastic offices structured much of this nightly bell schedule. Matins, traditionally observed around midnight or early morning, required bells to wake monks and announce the service to the community. Lauds followed at dawn. These were predictable, regular, and used specific bell patterns that became familiar through repetition. A medieval urbanite living near a monastery or major church would hear these bells nightly throughout their life. The brain's acoustic processing adapted to treat these sounds as expected, non-threatening environmental features that didn't require conscious attention. The bells became like breathing or heartbeat, present but not demanding awareness unless something changed. Modern sleep research confirms that humans can learn to sleep through regular, predictable sounds while remaining responsive to irregular or unexpected noises. This is adaptive biology that helped ancestors survive by filtering environmental noise that posed no threat while maintaining alertness to potential danger. Medieval people exploited this biology by creating bell systems where routine sounds were deliberately made regular and predictable, allowing subconscious filtering, while emergency sounds were made irregular and distinct, triggering arousal responses. The bell language evolved to work with human neurology rather than against it, creating a communication system that operated through sleep without disrupting it unnecessarily. Children learned this skill through gradual habituation that modern urban children learn with traffic noise or sirens. An infant might initially wake at every bell. Over months and years, the infant's brain learned which bell patterns were routine and which required response. By adulthood, a person could sleep through complex bell sequences announcing multiple monastic offices, while waking immediately at the sound of fire bells or invasion alarms. This wasn't conscious filtering, it was neurological adaptation that operated automatically. The medieval urbanite couldn't necessarily explain how they distinguished routine from emergency bells, but they could do it reliably, even when wakened from deep sleep. The system occasionally failed, usually during unusual circumstances. If bells rang at unexpected times or in novel patterns, people might wake confused, uncertain whether the sound signaled danger or was simply unusual timing for routine announcements. If multiple bell towers rang contradictory messages, listeners might be unable to decode the intended meaning. These failures were rare because bell ringers followed strict protocols and cities coordinated bell schedules to minimize conflicts. But when failures occurred, they demonstrated how dependent the system was on regularity and coordination. The bell language only worked if speakers and listeners shared understanding of the code, and if speakers followed the code reliably. Deviation created confusion that could have serious consequences. When fire bells rang in a medieval city, they initiated a coordinated community response that modern emergency services would recognize as systematic despite the lack of professional fire departments. The bells announced not just the presence of fire, but often its location through variations in which bells rang and in what sequence. A fire near the north gate might trigger bells from northern churches first, with southern churches joining later or not at all. A fire in the central district might ring all bells simultaneously. Trained listeners could often determine approximate fire location by paying attention to which bells rang first and most vigorously, allowing people to respond appropriately based on whether they were near the fire or distant from it. The community response followed established protocols that were practiced and enforced through law and custom. Upon hearing fire bells, able-bodied adults were expected to grab leather buckets, which most households kept hanging near doors for exactly this purpose, and proceed to the fire location. The bucket brigades that formed were not random crowds, but organized chains with specific roles assigned based on physical capability and proximity to water sources. Young, strong men positioned near water sources filled buckets. Others formed lines, passing full buckets toward the fire and empty buckets back to water sources. Women and older men often staffed the return lines or helped evacuate buildings. Children ran messages and fetched additional equipment. The effectiveness of this system depended entirely on people responding quickly and correctly to the fire bells. This is why the bells needed to be unmistakable, and why training the community to distinguish fire bells from all other bell signals was critical civic education. A city where half the population slept through fire bells, or where people confused fire bells with other announcements, would burn regularly. Medieval cities with good bell systems and well-trained populations could mobilize hundreds of firefighters within minutes of fire discovery. This capacity saved countless buildings and lives, making the investment in bell systems and bell training economically rational beyond their religious and timekeeping functions. Some cities developed increasingly sophisticated bell protocols for fire response as medieval period progressed. By the 14th century, some Italian cities had different bell patterns indicating fire size and severity. A minor fire that local residents could likely handle might trigger abbreviated bell sequences. A major fire threatening multiple buildings would trigger maximum alarm with all bells ringing continuously. This gradation allowed proportional response, where serious fires got full community mobilization, while minor fires got adequate but not excessive attention. The system prevented alarm fatigue, where people might begin ignoring bells if every small fire triggered maximum alarm, while ensuring that genuine emergencies received appropriate response. The social expectations around fire response were enforced through shame and sometimes law. A person who failed to respond to fire bells without legitimate excuse faced community judgment and potential fines. This wasn't just about fire suppression. It was about maintaining the social contract where everyone contributed to collective security. The bucket you carried to your neighbor's fire might save your own house when your turn came. The person who shirked duty during others' emergencies couldn't expect help during their own crises. Fire bells announced both danger and obligation, creating moments where community solidarity was tested and demonstrated publicly. Your response to fire bells revealed your character to your neighbors in ways that had lasting social consequences. Medieval cities facing external military threats needed rapid mobilization systems that could organize defensive responses before enemies breached walls. The bell systems served this function through specific patterns that announced invasion or siege, triggering protocols where adult males grabbed weapons and proceeded to assign defensive positions, while women, children, and elderly sought protected interior locations. The invasion bells were distinct from fire bells through different rhythms and patterns, but equally urgent and unmistakable. A trained population hearing invasion bells understood immediately that external danger threatened the community and that organized collective defense was essential for survival. The defensive coordination enabled by invasion bells was remarkably sophisticated for pre-industrial technology. Different bell patterns sometimes indicated which direction threats approached, allowing defensive forces to concentrate at relevant walls or gates. Some cities coordinated bell sequences across multiple towers to convey complex information about threat assessment. Initial short sequences might announce possible danger requiring alertness. Sustained ringing would confirm actual attack requiring mobilization. Specific patterns might indicate whether the threat was a raiding party, full siege force, or immediate breach. The bells essentially provided battlefield intelligence distribution to entire populations, creating information advantages that enhanced defensive effectiveness. The system required absolute trust in bell ringers during military emergencies. A bell ringer who failed to sound invasion alarms could doom the city. A bell ringer who sounded false alarms could cause panic, disruption, and loss of credibility for future genuine warnings. Some cities address these concerns through redundancy, having multiple bell ringers in different towers who could verify threats independently before ringing. Others placed military commanders in or near bell towers during periods of elevated threat, ensuring that invasion bells rang only when authorized by military authority. The bell ringers during wartime were essential military infrastructure, requiring protection and support equivalent to walls or gates. The psychological impact of invasion bells was profound. The sound triggered immediate physiological stress responses as people recognized mortal danger to themselves and their families. But the bells also triggered rehearsed behavioral patterns, where fear channeled into organized action rather than panic. People knew what to do when invasion bells rang because they had practiced and because social norms made appropriate response obligatory. The bells converted individual fear into collective action, transforming a population from frightened individuals into an organized defensive force. This transformation happened through sound, demonstrating how acoustic communication could shape behavior and coordinate action at population scale. Cities that invested in effective bell systems and population training for invasion response developed military advantages that sometimes meant the difference between successful defense and conquest. A city where the population mobilized quickly and cohesively in response to invasion bells presented harder targets than cities where defensive coordination was slow or chaotic. Enemies learned which cities had strong bell-coordinated defenses and sometimes chose to bypass them rather than face well-organized resistance. The investment in bells and training provided defensive deterrence beyond the immediate tactical advantages, making cities less likely targets simply through reputation for effective defensive coordination. Beyond emergencies and religious observances, bells served the mundane but essential function of timekeeping in societies where mechanical clocks were rare, expensive, and often inaccurate. The bell towers rang at regular intervals throughout day and night, announcing hours and sometimes quarter or half hours, allowing people to coordinate activities and manage schedules without personal timepieces. This public timekeeping was infrastructure as important as streets or water supply, enabling commercial activity, labor coordination, and social organization that required temporal synchronization. The bells literally made time public and shared rather than private and variable, creating standardized temporal frameworks that medieval economies required. The timekeeping bells used simpler patterns than emergency signals because they needed to convey only basic information about the hour. A single bell might ring 3 times to announce the 3rd hour, 6 times for 6th hour, and so on. These patterns were easy to count and remember, requiring no elaborate training beyond basic numeracy. Children learned to tell time by bells as naturally as they learned any other aspect of daily life. The regularity of time bells also contributed to habituation that allowed people to sleep through them. The midnight bells ringing 12 times were expected and familiar, fading into background for sleeping listeners while remaining available for anyone awake who needed time information. Different cities and regions used varying systems for defining and announcing hours, creating some complexity for travelers, but generally working well within specific communities. Some areas used equal hours, dividing day and night into 12 hours each, meaning that hours were different lengths in summer versus winter when daylight duration changed. Other areas adopted equinoctial hours that divided the full day into 24 equal units regardless of season. These different systems required different bell protocols, but within any specific city, the system was consistent and learned by residents. The bells literally structured time perception for medieval people in ways that shaped how they experienced daily rhythms. Commercial activity organized around time bells in ways that modern business schedules organized around clock time. Markets opened at specific bell hours. Workers began shifts at announced times. Courts convened when bells signaled. Meals happened at bell-designated hours. The bells created temporal grids that aligned individual and collective activities, enabling coordination that increased economic efficiency and social organization. A merchant who arranged to meet a customer at the 5th bell hour could do so reliably because both parties heard the same public time announcement. This coordination was impossible before standardized public timekeeping, making time bells fundamental infrastructure for medieval commerce and governance. The loss or malfunction of time bells created genuine disruption to medieval urban life. If a bell tower was damaged or if bell ringers were unavailable, the community lost its shared temporal reference system. People couldn't coordinate activities reliably. Workers didn't know when to begin or end shifts. Markets couldn't open at consistent times. The absence of time bells demonstrated how dependent medieval urban life had become on acoustic time infrastructure. Modern people with personal timepieces might not appreciate how essential public time bells were to societies where few individuals owned clocks, and where synchronization of activities required shared, audible time announcements that reached entire communities simultaneously. Curfew bells announced the time when residents were expected to extinguish fires, close businesses, and stay indoors unless they had legitimate reasons to be abroad. The word curfew derives from French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, referring to the practice of covering or extinguishing hearth fires to reduce nighttime fire risks. The bells that announced curfew served multiple purposes. They reduced fire hazards by ensuring that fewer people maintained active flames at night. They simplified law enforcement by making anyone abroad after curfew automatically suspicious, and they reinforced social hierarchies by creating nighttime as a time of rest that deviates from required explanation and justification. The enforcement of curfew varied by status and occupation. Night workers like bakers, watchmen, and certain craftsmen could be abroad after curfew because their work required it. Wealthy individuals could often get special permissions or simply pay fines if caught after curfew. Poor people without legitimate excuses faced harsher penalties and more aggressive enforcement. This created temporal segregation, where night became a time associated with work, necessity, or privilege, while ordinary rest and recreation were confined to daylight and early evening hours. The curfew bells announced not just time, but also the transition from regulated day use of urban space to restricted night use governed by different rules and expectations. The relationship between curfew bells and sexual regulation was direct and intentional. Many sexual prohibitions were harder to enforce during darkness, when people could move and meet discreetly. Curfew reduced opportunities for clandestine sexual activity by making nighttime presence abroad suspicious and legally questionable. Prostitutes working after curfew faced additional charges beyond regular prostitution fines. Couples attempting secret meetings after curfew could be prosecuted not just for fornication or adultery, but also for curfew violation. The temporal regulation through curfew bells reinforced moral regulation by restricting when and where sexual activity could feasibly occur, making enforcement easier and deterrence stronger. Some cities developed elaborate exceptions to curfew for specific circumstances. Religious processions, certain festivals, or emergency situations might suspend curfew temporarily. Wedding celebrations sometimes received curfew exemptions, allowing continued festivity through night. These exceptions required formal authorization and sometimes involved distinctive bell patterns announcing the temporary suspension of normal curfew rules. The flexibility demonstrated that curfew wasn't absolute moral principle, but pragmatic tool that could be modified when circumstances justified. The bells that normally announced restriction could announce exemption, demonstrating how the acoustic infrastructure served adaptable governance rather than rigid enforcement. The bells that normally announced restriction could announce exemption, demonstrating how the acoustic infrastructure served adaptable governance rather than rigid enforcement. The psychological effect of curfew bells was to create daily rhythms where day and night had distinct characters and different governing rules. Modern cities operate continuously, with nighttime often busier than day in entertainment districts. Medieval cities treated night as fundamentally different time, requiring different behaviors and different relationship to public space. The curfew bells marked the boundary between these temporal zones, creating audible transitions that shaped how people understood and used time. The sound of curfew bells meant not just that the hour had arrived, but that the nature of permissible urban life was changing, requiring people to adapt their activities and locations to match the newly restrictive nocturnal regulatory environment. Death bells announced individual deaths to communities, beginning processes of collective grieving and funeral preparation that were essential social functions in medieval life, where death was frequent, visible, and communally managed. When someone died, bells would ring in specific patterns indicating death announcement rather than other messages. The number of tolls sometimes indicated the deceased person's age or social status. Extended ringing patterns might announce deaths of particularly important community members. The bells transformed private family loss into public community event, ensuring that everyone knew of the death and could participate in appropriate mourning behaviors and funeral preparations. The social function of death bells extended beyond simple announcement. They initiated a series of community obligations where neighbors helped with funeral preparation, provided food to the bereaved family, attended funeral services, and offered condolences. The bells created public knowledge that triggered these reciprocal support systems that were essential to medieval social safety nets. A family grieving alone without community support faced practical and emotional challenges that could be devastating. The death bells ensured that isolation wasn't possible, that deaths became community experiences where mutual obligations of support and mourning were activated through the acoustic announcement that reached all residents simultaneously. The pattern and duration of death bells conveyed social information about the deceased. A brief, simple sequence might announce a common person's death. Prolonged, elaborate bell sequences announced deaths of nobles, prominent merchants, or important clergy. This acoustic hierarchy made social status audible, reminding the community of stratification even in death. Everyone heard that some deaths merited more bell attention than others, reinforcing understandings about whose lives mattered more in the community's acoustic memory. The bells didn't make everyone equal in death. They announced inequality through sound, creating public recognitions of social importance that were impossible to ignore when bells rang for hours announcing a noble's death compared to brief tolls for a peasant. Death bells also served practical functions in managing disease response. During plague outbreaks, the frequency and pattern of death bells conveyed information about disease progression and severity. When death bells rang constantly, everyone understood that epidemic was worsening. When the frequency of death bells decreased, people recognized improvement. This acoustic epidemiology allowed populations to assess disease status without formal public health reporting systems. The bells essentially provided disease surveillance data through the cumulative pattern of death announcements, creating shared situational awareness that helped communities make decisions about commerce, travel, and social interaction during disease outbreaks. The emotional impact of death bells was complex. They were simultaneously comforting and disturbing, providing acknowledgement of loss, while also reminding all listeners of mortality and the constant presence of death in medieval life. Children growing up hearing death bells regularly developed relationships with mortality that modern children shielded from death awareness might not experience. The bells made death public and normal, integrating it into daily soundscape rather than hiding it in hospitals and funeral homes as modern societies tend to do. Whether this produced healthier or more traumatic relationships with death is debatable, but it certainly created populations that understood death as ordinary rather than exceptional, as community event rather than private trauma. The control of bell systems represented significant political power in medieval cities because the bells were primary public communication infrastructure. Whoever controlled what bells said to the population controlled information flow, emergency response coordination, and temporal structuring of daily life. This made bell towers strategic assets that political factions fought to control during conflicts. Seizing the bell tower in a coup or uprising meant controlling the city's communication system, allowing the victorious faction to announce their legitimacy, coordinate their forces, and structure public response to the power transition. Bell towers were fortified not just against external enemies, but also against internal political rivals who might try to seize them during factional conflicts. Many cities formalized bell control through guild systems, where bell ringers formed professional organizations that regulated access to the trade and maintained standards for performance. These bell ringers' guilds had significant informal power because only guild members knew the complete bell language code and protocols for ringing different messages. City governments needed cooperation from bell ringers' guilds to maintain communication infrastructure, giving guilds leverage in negotiations about wages, working conditions, and privileges. Some guilds exploited this leverage to gain better compensation or special rights. Others used their position to influence municipal politics through threats of work stoppages that would disable communication infrastructure during crucial moments. The political nature of bell control became especially visible during factional conflicts. If a bell ringer supported one political faction and refused to ring bells announcing orders from opposing factions, he could effectively silence those authorities and prevent their communications from reaching the population. Some cities addressed this risk through redundancy, ensuring multiple bell towers controlled by different authorities or factions so no single group could monopolize acoustic communication. Others demanded political neutrality from bell ringers as condition of employment, though enforcing neutrality was difficult when bell ringers had their own factional sympathies and loyalties. The tension between bells as neutral infrastructure and bells as political tools never fully resolved. Religious authorities also competed for bell control because bells announced religious observances and structured devotional life. In cities where secular and ecclesiastical powers were separated, conflicts arose over who controlled which bells for which purposes. Could city government use cathedral bells for secular announcements? Could bishops prevent secular authorities from using church bells for non-religious purposes? These jurisdictional disputes revealed how valuable acoustic infrastructure was to both religious and political authority, neither of which could effectively govern populations without ability to communicate broadly and immediately through bells. The settlements varied by city and time, but generally involved negotiated power sharing, where both secular and religious authorities had some access to bell systems under specified circumstances. These settlements varied by city and time, but generally involved negotiated power sharing, where both secular and religious authorities had some access to bell systems under specified circumstances. The ultimate demonstration of bell power was the silence that occurred when bells stopped ringing during interdicts, periods when popes forbade religious services in specific territories as punishment for political conflicts with rulers. During interdicts, all church bells fell silent except for death announcements. The sudden absence of routine timekeeping bells, religious observance bells, and other daily bell functions created profound disruption to communities that had structured life around acoustic infrastructure. The silence was a devastating psychological tool that demonstrated how dependent medieval urban life had become on bells. When the bells went silent, time became uncertain, coordination failed, and the acoustic fabric of daily life unraveled. The eventual lifting of interdicts and resumption of bell ringing was celebrated as much for restoration of infrastructure as for restoration of religious services. Medieval cities planned their acoustic environments with more sophistication than modern people often recognize. The placement of bell towers, the selection of bell sizes and tones, and the coordination of bell schedules across multiple churches all reflected deliberate design intended to maximize communication effectiveness while minimizing confusion. Cities didn't just build bell towers wherever convenient. They positioned them to provide good acoustic coverage across the urban area, considering how sound propagated through streets and how buildings affected bell audibility. Some cities even conducted what we might call acoustic surveys, testing whether bells from proposed tower locations could be heard throughout relevant districts before investing in construction. The coordination of multiple bell systems in cities with numerous churches required careful management to prevent acoustic chaos, where too many bells ringing different messages simultaneously created confusion rather than communication. Cities developed protocols for bell priority and timing separation. During emergencies like fires, all bells could ring the same alarm simultaneously. But during routine operations, churches coordinated schedules so timekeeping bells from different towers didn't overlap unnecessarily. Religious observance bells staggered their ringing so that bells announcing services at different churches didn't compete with each other. This coordination required formal agreements among religious institutions and ongoing maintenance of those agreements as personnel and circumstances changed. The acoustic quality of bells themselves was carefully controlled through testing and sometimes rejection of bells that didn't meet standards. Bell founding was skilled craft where slight variations in metal composition or casting technique created different tones. Cities commissioning new bells would test them carefully before installation to ensure the tone was distinct from existing bells, that the sound carried appropriately across the urban area, and that the bell integrated well into the existing acoustic environment. Rejected bells might be recast until they met requirements. This quality control ensured that bell systems remained effective communication infrastructure rather than deteriorating into indistinct noise that people couldn't decode reliably. Building regulations sometimes addressed bell-related concerns, particularly regarding structures that might block or distort bell sound propagation. Constructing a tall building in the acoustic path between a bell tower and a district that needed to hear that tower could create enforcement problems that the construction approval process needed to address. Some cities prohibited certain types of construction in critical acoustic corridors to maintain bell communication effectiveness. These regulations treated acoustic space as infrastructure requiring protection and management similar to streets or water supply, recognizing that effective urban communication depended on maintaining acoustic paths that sound could travel along without excessive absorption or distortion. The preservation of bell acoustic environments occasionally created conflicts with economic development. A merchant who wanted to build a profitable structure that would partially block bell sound faced opposition from authorities concerned about communication infrastructure. A church that wanted to add construction that would alter its bell tower's acoustic properties might need permission from city government to ensure the changes wouldn't degrade communication effectiveness. These conflicts required balancing economic development against infrastructure maintenance, with settlements that sometimes limited construction, sometimes required acoustic mitigation, and sometimes allowed changes after recalibrating bell systems to maintain effectiveness despite physical environmental changes. Bell systems could fail in ways that endangered communities. Fires in bell towers could destroy bells or kill bell ringers, disabling communication infrastructure exactly when it was most needed. Enemy attacks sometimes targeted bell towers specifically to disable defensive coordination. Bell ringers could be incapacitated by disease, drunk on duty, or simply absent when needed. Bells could crack or break from overuse or metal fatigue. These failures revealed the vulnerability of acoustic communication infrastructure and demonstrated why redundancy and backup systems were essential. Cities that invested only in single bell towers with minimal redundancy faced catastrophic communication failures when primary systems failed during emergencies. Weather also affected bell effectiveness in ways that created communication challenges. Heavy rain dampened sound propagation, reducing the distance bells could be heard. Strong winds distorted bell sounds and could make messages harder to interpret. Thunder and other natural loud sounds competed with bells for attention. Fog created acoustic distortions that made bell location difficult to determine. Snow absorption reduced bell sound carrying distance significantly. These weather effects meant that bell systems worked best in fair conditions and became progressively less reliable as weather degraded. Cities couldn't control weather, but they could design bell systems with enough redundancy and volume that they remained effective even in adverse acoustic conditions. The human factor created additional failure modes. Bell ringers were expected to be sober, alert, and reliable, but they were human and subject to human failures. A drunk bell ringer might ring wrong messages or fail to ring necessary alarms. A sleeping bell ringer might miss emergencies requiring immediate acoustic response. A bell ringer bribed by enemies might deliberately fail to ring invasion alarms or might ring false alarms to create confusion. Cities addressed these risks through monitoring, backup ringers, and severe penalties for dereliction of duty. But no system could completely eliminate human unreliability. The communication infrastructure was only as reliable as the humans operating it, which meant it was imperfect and occasionally catastrophically failed. The greatest systematic failure of bell systems was their inability to convey complex information beyond pre-established codes. Bells could announce categories of messages but couldn't provide details. Fire bells announced fire but couldn't specify which building was burning or how severe the fire was beyond crude severity categories. Invasion bells announced attack but couldn't provide detailed intelligence about enemy numbers, composition, or objectives. The limitations of acoustic communication meant that bells were initial alerts requiring follow-up through visual observation, messenger runners, or other information channels. Bells were extraordinarily effective for basic signaling, but couldn't replace more detailed communication technologies that could convey nuanced information. Communities occasionally experienced false alarms or miscommunications that revealed bell system weaknesses. A bell ringing accidentally might trigger mass panic if people mistook it for emergency signal. Bell ringers practicing new sequences might confuse populations who interpreted practice as real messages. Mechanical failures causing bells to ring spontaneously created false alarms that disrupted activities and damaged system credibility. Each incident of miscommunication or false alarm reduced public trust in bell systems slightly, making people more hesitant to respond to future bell signals. Maintaining system integrity required not just technical reliability, but also communication effectiveness that preserved public confidence that bells conveyed accurate information requiring appropriate responses. The connection between sexual misconduct fines and bell system funding wasn't direct in most cases, but both were part of integrated municipal finance systems where various revenue sources supported various infrastructure needs. A city might use prostitution fines for bridge construction while using other revenues for bell tower maintenance. But the overall fiscal framework treated both as legitimate uses of public funds generated through moral regulation. The integration meant that supporting the Bell system indirectly supported the entire infrastructure funding approach that included monetizing sexual misconduct. The citizens who benefited from Bell communication also implicitly accepted the moral framework that funded public works through penalties for behavior that generated those revenues. Some cities did directly connect sexual misconduct fines to Bell-related expenses in ways that made the relationship explicit. Funds from prostitution licensing might pay bell ringers' wages. Adultery penalties might fund bell tower repairs. These direct connections created interesting moral situations where the bell ringers calling people to prayer were paid with prostitution money, and the bells announcing religious observances rang in towers maintained through adultery fines. Medieval people generally didn't find this as troubling as modern people might because they accepted the theological framework of redemptive revenue, where sin money became holy through proper use. The bells themselves were sacred, regardless of how they were funded, and the messages they carried served God's purposes, even if the funding came from activities God condemned. Medieval people generally didn't find this as troubling as modern people might because they accepted the theological framework of redemptive revenue, where sin money become holy through proper use. The bells themselves were sacred, regardless of how they were funded, and the messages they carried served God's purposes, even if the funding came from activities God condemned. The sustainability of both systems depended on maintaining careful balance between condemnation and tolerance. Too strict enforcement of sexual morality would reduce revenues below levels needed for infrastructure maintenance. Too lax enforcement would undermine moral authority and create social disorder that infrastructure couldn't solve. Too loud or frequent bell ringing created alarm fatigue and habituation that degraded communication effectiveness. Too infrequent bell use meant populations forgot bell codes and couldn't respond appropriately during emergencies. Medieval cities had to calibrate both systems continuously, adjusting enforcement intensity and bell usage patterns to maintain optimal function without pushing either system past its operational limits. The success of both systems can be measured by their longevity and spread. Monetized sexual regulation funded infrastructure across medieval Europe for centuries, demonstrating that the approach was economically viable and politically sustainable despite moral complications. Bell communication systems lasted even longer, with some medieval bell systems remaining operational into the industrial era before being gradually superseded by mechanical clocks, telegraphs, and eventually modern communication technologies. The persistence of both systems suggests they addressed real needs effectively enough that benefits outweighed costs and moral concerns. Medieval people weren't stupid or naively pious. They were pragmatic problem solvers who developed systems that worked within their technological capabilities and cultural frameworks. Modern parallels exist in how contemporary societies integrate moral regulation with public funding, and in how we create communication infrastructure that must function reliably without creating information overload. Sin taxes on alcohol, tobacco, and gambling generate public revenues while supposedly discouraging harmful behaviors, precisely mirroring medieval sexual misconduct fines in structure and justification. Emergency alert systems must grab attention during crises while avoiding false alarms that create complacency, facing the same calibration challenges medieval bell systems faced. The medieval solutions to these problems weren't perfect, but they weren't naive either. They represent serious attempts by intelligent people to solve coordination problems using available tools and acceptable frameworks. We should study them not to mock medieval limitations, but to learn from medieval successes and failures as we address similar challenges with different technologies. Women bore disproportionate burdens under medieval sexual misconduct fine systems in ways that demonstrated and reinforced patriarchal social structures. Prostitutes who were women paid fines for prostitution, while their male clients rarely faced penalties. Women caught in adultery paid fines while their male partners often avoided prosecution through social privilege or financial influence. Unwed mothers faced fornication charges, while the fathers sometimes evaded responsibility entirely. The moral framework officially condemned sexual sin by both genders equally, but the enforcement system fell primarily on women who had fewer resources to avoid detection, less social power to negotiate settlements, and more visible evidence of sexual activity through pregnancy or association with prostitution districts. The fiscal implications meant that infrastructure funding came disproportionately from fines paid by women for sexual behaviors that men participated in but were less often penalized for. The bridges, walls, and public buildings built with sexual misconduct fines were funded largely by women's penalties, while men who engaged in the same behaviors contributed less to infrastructure financing. This created a perverse situation where women who were economically marginalized through lower wages and restricted property rights also faced higher moral regulation costs that funded infrastructure serving entire communities, including the man who faced less regulation. The system was wealth transfer from marginalized women to general public through mechanism of selective moral enforcement. Some women navigated this system strategically by negotiating with authorities, developing relationships with officials who could reduce fines or provide warning about enforcement actions, or organizing among themselves to resist arbitrary penalties. Prostitute communities sometimes pooled resources to help members pay fines or to negotiate better terms with city authorities. Women caught in adultery might leverage family connections or threaten to expose male partners to negotiate reduced penalties. These resistance strategies rarely challenged the system fundamentally, but allowed individual women to reduce their personal burden within a structure that systematically disadvantaged them. The success of these strategies depended on individual circumstances and the political relationships specific women could access. The moral discourse around sexual regulation revealed complicated gender attitudes, where women were simultaneously blamed for sexual sin and understood as economic resources whose fines funded public goods. Moralists condemned prostitutes as dangerous temptresses leading men astray, but city accountants recognized prostitution revenues as reliable funding sources for important projects. Women's sexuality was framed as both moral threat requiring control and economic asset requiring management. This contradiction created legal and cultural frameworks where women were punished for sexual behavior while also being tacitly protected from excessive punishment that would eliminate the behavior and its associated revenues. The pragmatic need for funds moderated the moral impulse for suppression. Modern feminist analysis of these systems reveals how medieval societies integrated gender oppression with fiscal policy in ways that made patriarchal power economically productive for ruling classes. Women's subordination wasn't just social or religious ideology. It was also revenue generation mechanism that funded infrastructure serving patriarchal power structures. The bridges prostitutes' fines built enabled commerce benefiting male merchants. The walls adultery penalties funded protected property owned primarily by men. The public buildings fornication fees constructed housed governance dominated by men. Sexual regulation of women was simultaneously moral enforcement and taxation of the marginalized, serving both ideological and fiscal purposes that reinforced male domination while generating revenues that male authorities controlled and deployed for purposes men decided. The integration was comprehensive and revealing. Medieval cities were acoustic environments in ways that modern cities with visual signage, written communication, and digital media can barely approximate. Sound carried information, structured time, coordinated activity, and created shared experiences that formed the basis of community identity. The bells that rang throughout day and night weren't just functional communication tools. They were the voice of the city itself, creating an acoustic identity that residents recognized and outsiders found distinct. Each city had its own bell signature, its own rhythms and patterns that identified it as audibly as visual architecture or geographic location. Traveling to a new city meant learning to hear differently, to decode unfamiliar bell codes and adjust to different acoustic temporal frameworks. Each city had its own bell signature, its own rhythms and patterns that identified it as audibly as visual architecture or geographic location. Traveling to a new city meant learning to hear differently, to decode unfamiliar bell codes and adjust to different acoustic temporal frameworks. This acoustic identity created social memory and community cohesion in ways that text-based or visual communication couldn't replicate. Everyone heard the bells, regardless of literacy, economic status, or visual ability. The blind could navigate temporal structures as well as the sighted through acoustic information that was universally accessible. Illiterate populations could coordinate activities through bell signals as effectively as literate populations through written schedules. The bells created equality of information access that written communication couldn't match, making them genuinely democratic infrastructure that served everyone without requiring specialized training or cognitive abilities beyond basic hearing and cultural familiarity with local codes. The memories associated with specific bell sounds created powerful emotional connections to place and community. A person who grew up hearing specific bell patterns developed lifelong associations between those sounds and home. Exiles far from their native cities might be moved to tears by hearing similar bell patterns that reminded them of childhood. The bells were more than information carriers. They were emotional anchors that tied individuals to places and communities through sensory memories that endured across lifetimes. Modern people form similar attachments to visual landmarks or smells, but medieval people's acoustic orientation created relationships to sonic environments that modern urban life rarely replicates. The transition away from bell-dominated communication toward visual and written information systems represented fundamental shift in how cities communicated with residents and how residents experienced urban life. The gradual introduction of public clocks, written notices, newspapers, and eventually electronic communication reduced dependence on acoustic infrastructure. The bells that once structured every aspect of daily life became primarily religious instruments, announcing church services to the still faithful, while most urban communication shifted to visual and textual channels. This transition changed the character of urban experience from primarily acoustic to primarily visual. From shared communal reception of broadcast sound to individualized reading of targeted text. From time as public collective experience to time as private personal management. What was lost in this transition deserves recognition, even as we acknowledge what was gained. The acoustic city created certain types of community coherence, information equality, and shared temporal experience that visual and textual cities struggle to replicate. Everyone heard the bell simultaneously, creating collective moments that modern, fragmented media consumption rarely produces. The bells structured community life through sound that was immediate, compelling, and universally accessible. Modern cities, with their visual complexity and textual information overload, serve some functions better than medieval acoustic cities, but they also create social isolation, information inequality, and temporal fragmentation that bell cities avoided through their acoustic character. The medieval bell city wasn't superior to modern cities, but it had qualities worth understanding and perhaps occasionally worth mourning. Thank you for spending over 2 hours exploring these intertwined medieval systems with me. If you found value in understanding how cities integrated moral regulation with infrastructure funding and acoustic communication, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Candle History and share your thoughts below. What surprised you most about these systems? Can you think of modern equivalents that integrate different aspects of governance the way medieval cities did? I genuinely read every comment. We began with two seemingly unrelated systems: sexual misconduct fines funding public works, and bell communication operating through nights without causing panic. Now, hours later, you understand that both systems reveal the same medieval genius for integrating multiple purposes into single institutional frameworks. The prostitute's fine didn't just punish sin, it funded bridges that served commerce. The adultery penalty didn't just correct moral failure, it built walls that protected communities. The bells that announced religious services also told time, coordinated emergency response, and structured daily rhythms. Nothing in medieval urban life was single purpose. Everything served multiple functions, because cities couldn't afford to waste resources on specialized systems when integrated approaches could accomplish several goals simultaneously. The pragmatism underlying both systems should make us reconsider stereotypes about medieval superstition and impracticality. Medieval authorities weren't naively pious idealists who let religious principle override practical necessity. They were sophisticated operators who figured out how to fund infrastructure without crushing taxation, how to communicate complex information with simple technology, and how to maintain social order through systems that acknowledged human weakness while extracting economic benefit from it. They couldn't eliminate prostitution, so they regulated and monetized it. They couldn't prevent adultery, so they penalized and profited from it. They couldn't give everyone personal timepieces, so they created public acoustic time that everyone could access. These were intelligent solutions to real constraints. Modern societies face similar challenges of funding infrastructure, regulating behavior, and coordinating collective action. We typically approach these challenges through separated systems rather than integrated frameworks. Infrastructure funding comes from taxation systems deliberately separated from moral enforcement. Communication infrastructure operates independently from religious institutions. Behavioral regulation usually doesn't generate revenue for public works. We've compartmentalized what medieval people integrated, gaining some advantages from specialization, but losing some benefits of integration. Whether this represents progress depends on what you value: transparency or efficiency, principle or pragmatism, ideological purity or practical results. The gender dynamics of medieval sexual regulation remain deeply troubling even when understood within historical context. Women bore unjust burdens of a system that exploited their economic and social vulnerability, while male participants in the same behaviors faced less enforcement. The infrastructure built with women's fines served patriarchal power structures that oppressed those women. Understanding the fiscal logic doesn't excuse the injustice. It reveals how gender oppression integrated with economic exploitation in ways that made patriarchy profitable for ruling classes. Modern societies that claim to have eliminated such exploitation should examine whether contemporary systems might embed similar dynamics in less visible ways. The acoustic city represents something genuinely lost from modern urban experience that we might occasionally wish to recover. The equality of information access that Bells provided, the collective temporal experience they created, and the community coherence they fostered through shared acoustic environment had real value that visual and textual communication can't fully replace. Modern cities are more informationally dense, but often less communally coherent than medieval acoustic cities. We've gained individual autonomy and information specialization, but lost some collective synchronization and acoustic community. Neither system is clearly superior. They represent different trade-offs between individual and collective, between specialized and universal, between autonomy and coherence. The bell systems that operated through medieval nights without cause and panic demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human acoustic cognition that modern emergency communication systems could learn from. Medieval people understood that habituation to regular patterns allowed filtering of routine signals while maintaining alertness to irregular emergency patterns. They designed bell codes that worked with human neurology rather than against it, creating systems that were both robust and reliable. Modern emergency alerts often violate these principles by using similar tones for different severity levels, or by triggering so many low-severity alerts that people develop alarm fatigue and ignore genuine emergencies. Medieval bellmasters knew better. The integration of religious and civic functions in medieval bell systems created capabilities that modern separated systems struggle to replicate. When religious institutions control communication infrastructure, they can coordinate moral teaching with emergency response and temporal organization in ways that purely secular systems can't achieve. This integration had costs, particularly in religious coercion and limited pluralism. But it also had benefits in creating unified frameworks where spiritual meaning, practical coordination, and community identity reinforced each other. Modern pluralistic societies rightly separated religious and civic institutions for important reasons, but that separation created coordination challenges that medieval integration solved through its unified framework. The economic framework that transformed sin into infrastructure through monetary penalties reveals medieval authorities' capacity for moral complexity that makes modern binary morality look simplistic. Medieval people could simultaneously believe that prostitution was sin requiring punishment and practical reality requiring regulation. They could condemn adultery morally while profiting from it financially. They could maintain theological positions about sexual purity while building fiscal systems dependent on sexual misconduct. This wasn't hypocrisy so much as sophisticated understanding that moral ideals and practical realities don't always align, and that governance requires navigating that tension rather than pretending it doesn't exist. The bridges funded by prostitution fines still stand in some European cities, physical monuments to medieval fiscal pragmatism that tourists cross without knowing their origin. The bell towers still ring in old city centers, though their messages are now mostly limited to religious observance and tourist atmosphere, rather than the comprehensive communication functions they once served. These remnants preserve evidence of medieval systems that solved real problems in ways that worked for centuries before modern approaches superseded them. They deserve recognition not as quaint historical curiosities, but as serious attempts by intelligent people to govern complex urban societies using tools and frameworks available to them. The lesson, if there is one, is that effectiveness and morality don't always align, that integration and specialization offer different advantages, and that acoustic communication created urban experiences quite different from modern visual and textual cities. Medieval people weren't primitive versions of modern people waiting for progress to liberate them from superstition. They were sophisticated problem solvers who developed complex systems addressing real challenges. Some of those systems were unjust, particularly regarding gender. Some were morally complicated in ways that remain uncomfortable. But all of them worked well enough for long enough that we should study them seriously rather than dismissing them as backward medieval confusion. We began wondering how sex fines funded bridges and how bells worked without panic. We end understanding that medieval cities integrated what we separate, coordinated through sound what we coordinate through text, and monetized what we tax. The prostitute's fine and the bell's ring were both parts of urban systems that solved fundamental governance challenges, funding infrastructure, coordinating populations, regulating behavior, and maintaining order. The specific solutions were medieval, but the problems were universal. We still need infrastructure funding, population coordination, behavioral regulation, and social order. We've developed different solutions using different technologies and different moral frameworks. Whether our solutions are better than medieval ones depends on criteria we use to judge: efficiency, equity, transparency, integration. The medieval systems might win on some criteria while losing on others. That complexity is the point. The final image I leave you with is a medieval urbanite in the darkness, listening to bells ring a complex pattern, immediately understanding whether it announces prayer time or fire alarm or invasion warning or someone's death. Then deciding how to respond based on a learned acoustic code that structured their entire relationship to their city, their community, and their time. That person lived in an acoustic world we've lost, funded by revenue systems we've abandoned, organized through integrated frameworks we've fragmented. They weren't better or worse than us. They were different. And understanding that difference reveals possibilities and trade-offs about urban life, communication, funding, and governance that our modern assumptions might otherwise hide. The bells spoke. The bridges stood. The system worked. That's worth knowing.